Well, good morning, guys. I am getting ready to begin making the sheath. So what I start out with is some pretty heavy cardstock here. It just makes good durable pattern material that doesn't flex when I try to trace an outline. And I'm going to be chopping this thing up as I do different parts of the construction. So what I start out with is an outline of the knife. And the very first thing I start out with is I keep in mind which hand the user is going to use. So Brian is right-handed. And the way I lay out my sheaths, I like to imagine that this side of the leather is flesh side coming up, the suede side of the leather. And so the knife is going to have a pouch sheath that's going to fold over this way, and then we'll stitch down this side. And I will write notations on the finished pattern after I cut this primary pattern up, and you'll see why. I make another pattern with all the pieces before I cut, and I keep that as a permanent one. Okay, that's zoomed in so you can kind of see what I've done here. So using that scribe mark I made, just as a loose reference, I kind of decided what the outside profile of my sheath's going to look like, and I came out wide, but you have to remember that when you form this around the knife, all of this is going to be drawn in when you force the wet form down and make it contour to this knife up in this area. So this is going to be sucked in a little bit, so you allow extra room. You want plenty of room for a good thick weld, and you also want a lot of room to run your stitching. Now I'm going to fold all this over. And I want to trace this again over on this side. Okay, so when I made my cut here to form over, I necessarily had to cut it in two at that point. So what I'm going to do now is take these pieces and I'm going to lay them on another piece of my stock and make a one-piece pattern. So I don't have to worry about taping this or any of that. Okay, this is a double shoulder of 8 to 10 ounce leather. And what I've done, I've got it top grain side up, so I flipped the pattern over. This is the top grain side of the sheath. And so I've just made a mark where my fold's going to go, and I've allowed that 4 inches up here. And what I do is I just scan the whole piece of leather, and I'm looking to avoid any sort of range marks, anything like that. And I know I'm cutting way out into the field, and common sense would say, well, why don't you start over on the edge? Well, maybe the edge has range marks. Range marks are scars, bug bites, just anything that blemishes the top grain side of the leather. So you have to avoid them. And these pieces over here will be used, all of it will be used for something, but for the outside of the sheath, I want unblemished leather. And I can follow that with my knife, and I'll remember to continue this line on up to the edge. So I just carefully follow, and I don't try to go too fast. And all these edges are going to be belt sanded down to final shape. This is still rather a rough layout. Now, before I turn this top grain down onto here, I'm going to get this board out of here because this board has a lot of cut marks and texture I don't want transferred to the grain side of my leather. I sand this tabletop now and again to remove any dirt. I don't really do dirty work in this side of the shop. This is woodworking. Sawdust, although it's dusty, really isn't dirty. It doesn't stain. But I'm going to get my edges dressed now because this is going to be stitched over and I won't be able to reach it. So I've got my edges dressed that I'm not going to be able to reach once I do the fold over and stitch this down, and it's actually going to fold this way and stitch inside of here, and that's your belt loop. I'm going to case the leather. Alright, so I'm just going to work up some lather here with the saddle soap. And I don't rinse this stuff off. This saddle soap puts back in what time has taken out of this leather. So whatever I leave in here is good for the leather. And when we're finished with everything, it's going to get saturated with neatsfoot oil and beeswax, a mixture, a hot mixture. It's going to further waterproof the sheath. This makes it really easy to work, and it's just good for the leather. It comes out of the tanning process. It lacks a lot of the stuff that this saddle soap puts back in. So you just want to wipe off the excess. And I didn't soak this leather to where it's not going to be workable. It dries pretty quickly. I'm going to set it out in the sun and come back when this has dried to the point where we can start making some folds and putting our cement on here. Okay, the next step for this is going to be dyeing the leather. And I'm going to use this burgundy dye that I really do like. Well, it's called Bordeaux, but I'm more of a burgundy man. Just want to put it on in even strokes, making sure you get good coverage. And like with wood stain, you let it soak in for just a little bit, then wipe off the excess. I ought to be wearing gloves, but you know, I guess I'm getting pretty notorious for having dirty hands. Plus I have some of that orange cleaner over there that even takes this stuff off. I want to do both sides of the leather. Now before I flip this over, make sure there's no bumps. I don't want marks on the top grain side of my leather. Really have to watch out for that when you're doing leather work. I know it's not real important to dye the inside, especially down here where eyes will never see it. But again, this stuff has conditioners in it that are only going to benefit the leather. I want to make sure you get your edges. These edges up here, these are going to get dyed after the fact on later stages. This doesn't take long to dry. When it dries to a point, you just buff it. It has a nice sheen. It's water-based. It's good stuff. So we're going to let that dry just a little bit, and we'll run a rag over it and proceed with the next step. Okay, so this is my leather stitching machine, and I have the camera set up over on a separate table where I keep my my sanders and stuff, because it's a hand-operated machine. I'll show you the hand crank up here. It's right here. And the instructions, the owner of the company who puts these out, his name is Ryan from Cowboy Sewing Machines, he specifically states that when you operate this machine, it's one fluid motion, and you do it rather briskly. He actually says, act like you're mad at the machine. So, you know, to do that, it's going to create a little shake in this workbench, and I don't want the transfer over to the camera. So what I've done, I went ahead and clamped and glued this, and then I just cut a little furrow, and that's to guide my stitches. Alright, I checked my bobbin, and I have enough thread to do this little bit of stitching, then I'll have to reload my bobbin. What you want to do is you want to gather this thread back here, and for the first couple of stitches that you do, you want to hold this thread tightly in your hand and hold tightness on it. And then after the second stitch, you can let go of it. So you lift the presser foot. There's a little, like a bicycle brake handle up here. You lift your presser foot. Now, you don't want to start at the very beginning. What you want to do is come in one stitch and stitch up to your beginning, and that's to lock the stitch. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. So I want to come back here
about 1/8 of an inch or so, and that's where I want to put my first stitch through. So I get my needle down into my furrow, and again, you're holding this thread, bobbin and the spool thread tightly back here to the rear, and you go down with one good solid motion, just like that. Now the beauty of this machine, you can lift your presser foot and you can position your next stitch just by wherever you want to put your needle. So I'm going right there for the corner, and I'm going to pick my thread up again, and this is going to be stitch number 2. Alright, now lift your presser foot and turn the whole thing around, and I'm going to go back through that first hole, and that's going to lock my stitches in. And now we don't have to worry about holding on to the thread. Once you get your needle started through the hole, now it's not so tedious. Now you just let the machine set your stitch length, and you see I'm going down with authority, and I'm at the corner. So then you want to lift your presser foot and turn and get your material positioned right where you want to be. Hit your next stitch, and then it's just on around following your groove. And I like this. Now if I were doing saddlery and things like that, yeah, this would get old, but I'm just doing knife sheaths, so this is a real work saver, and it does a more uniform stitch than I can do by hand. And it turns, you know, just stitching this little piece right here by hand, punching and then lacing, is about a 25-minute job. And if I weren't talking and videoing this, I'd already be done. So just one stitch at a time, work your thread around, and you can tighten up your stitches through this little radius right here if you want to. The machine lets you do that. Then when I get back out into the straightaway here, what little there is of it, I can go ahead and let the machine set the stitch length. I'm going to get one more stitch. And I'm going to finish up right on the corner. And then that's it. So you pick this up, then you cycle the machine, pump it a couple of times, and that feeds out thread. So you can pull it away from there. Then you just simply cut your stitches off, and I'm going to zoom back out. Now that you've gotten the gist of how this little machine works, it was worth what I paid for it. And I'll tell you, the guy, Ryan, that runs this outfit, is one of the most helpful people. If you have any issues, I had a very minor issue with the operation of this machine, and all it took was about a 10-minute phone call, and I was back up and running. And I didn't have to wait for him to call me. He called me right away. So now what I do, I cut all my thread out. You want to lift your presser foot, get everything back to the rear so you are ready. Now I'm going to have to reload my bobbin to do this long stitch. But one of the things that I do now, get any loose excess thread out of there. And then just for a safety measure or just a GP, what I do is I take a little drop of super glue and I lock my stitch in. Just the tiniest little drop.